Hello everyone, welcome back to the Red Music Box. My name is Varun and we are on the second episode of Practical Steps for a Good Song, starting from composition to mastering, and our topic for discussion today is arrangement. Do you know what I love about revolving chairs? When you are excited about a new topic that you're talking about, you can just go, woo. As a creator, it is not just important for us to create stuff, but it's also important how we present it. The presentation has a lot to do with whether our audience likes it or not. Let's draw a parallel. Now, take food, for example. We all love food. Now, all our favorite food that we go outside to fancy, expensive restaurants and binge and eat and spend lots of money can obviously be made at home and spend a lot less money doing that. But despite it, we still love going to our favorite restaurants and having these things. Why? Because of the ambience, the presentation, and the experience of going there and having it. It just feels like it tastes a lot better. And that's kind of how song arrangement kind of works. If you don't arrange your song, you may have an amazing idea. You might have fleshed your idea out really well. You might have tried all the options. You might have come to a final, product which you are convinced about, and you fail at decorating the song really well. You fail at presenting your song really well. And that's where your song begins to crumble and fall down. In a nutshell, arranging a song is taking your idea, decorating it with additional musical elements to build more excitement in your track. Let's look at some of the things to keep in mind while you are arranging your song. Tip number one, less is more. The first thing that happens when you start working on your idea, suppose you have a riff or a melody or a chord progression and you're kind of taking it forward and you're jamming on it with your band. There is a lot of excitement in the room. Everyone is smiling and you are smiling. And you feel like, wow, this seems to be the best thing. Now, here's what happens. You're so caught up in the excitement that you are just overplaying. You're playing more complicated strumming patterns and your drummers filling it up with extensive hi-hat patterns, maybe 16 note or 32nd notes or hitting the cymbals way too often, and your bass players kind of digging in too much too. Now this is where exactly we start making our first biggest mistake, overcrowding the song. So less is always more. Try to allow fewer things. Try to control your excitement when you're working through your idea in your jam room and you're working through it with your bandmates and your friends. Try and see if you can work carefully through this time so that you don't get too caught up with the excitement and forget that you're overcrowding your song. We certainly don't want that to happen in our song, so always go for less is more approach. You will be so much more happier when you do this, because the truth is it's way more easier to add things than to remove things. Once you've kind of added your stuff and you feel so attached to every little part that you're adding into your song that the moment that needs to be removed, you're not as happy as you were when you're adding it. So it's always better to have less than add more and then have to remove it later. Tip number two, silence is bliss. Overcrowding a song is a problem that is not only noticed in amateur songwriting, but sometimes you can notice this even in some of the commercially released songs. Oftentimes, the primary reason to overcrowd a song, in other words, add several layers and lots of tracks into a song, is because we're looking for a big sound. Now, bigness can often be achieved not by adding so many layers as much as adding a fewer layers and taking away all the extra information that you don't need. Now, for example, you have a basket, a really tiny basket, and you can only fit about 5 eggs in it. What happens if you start bringing in 7 or 8 eggs? You start forcing it in and your eggs are going to start breaking, right? Now, we don't want that to happen. Now, from an audio standpoint, open an EQ plugin. Just notice the frequency that is available. You'll often see that there's 20 hertz and there's 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz on the other end. Now, that's all the range that you have for you to fit in all your instruments and your vocals and all the other fancy soundscape layers that you plan to add in your song. Now, if you want all the elements to coexist and you're adding more than needed, you often need to shave chunks of information from each of these instruments in order for these instruments to allow other instruments to shine through. So what you're doing is you're taking away a lot of maybe mid frequencies, maybe high frequencies, maybe the lower mids or maybe the lows, and somehow you find that all the individual elements in your song is beginning to sound thin and weak and brittle, and you just don't like it. So here's a better way: add less, don't add too much, keep less elements in your song, and allow each element to occupy a wider frequency range so that it sounds full and big and at the same time doesn't quite eat into each other's space. Tip number 3: picturize your song. If you're writing a song to a brief, as we discussed in episode 1, sometimes your initial idea could be a picture. You may be writing to an advertisement or a short film or even a big budget movie, or you may have a book or a novel that you read and you're basing your song on the story from the novel. So you already have a brief there. Now, when you are doing something like this, picturizing your song can be the single biggest element which will help you connect your music to the brief that's available. For example, suppose you're writing a song for a movie which is based on a certain time period at a certain location or place. And the single best way that you can bring your song to connect to that is use elements that is relevant to that time period and the place that this story is based around. If you're writing a song for a film which is based in a countryside location, then you may want to use like really good folk and country elements in your song, maybe using those spring reverbs and tremolos, and your Telecaster type-ish sound will immediately give you a connect of a country music, a very Texas sort of a picture. If you're writing stuff for a film that is based in the southern India, for example, the South Indian movie that you're working on, try using instruments that are from South India. Try using instruments or even soundscapes that will remind you of South India. Or if you're working on a film or an advertisement which is based on futuristic sounds, which is based on something modern and technology based, then try using stuff like synths, which will help you almost sound and feel like a futuristic sound. And through that, you're building a connect to the brief that you're working on. So picturizing your song is extremely important. Tip number 4, virtual instruments. Now, what if you are not a part of a band? You are a solo singer-songwriter and you write songs at home, either with your piano or with your guitar, and you add your vocals to it, and now you have a convincing idea and you want to start working on arranging this track. This is where virtual instruments can really, really come in very handy, especially if you're alone and you don't have a band to jam your track with. You can try and simulate an experience such as that using virtual instruments and trying to build your ideas to see if certain elements are working or it's not working. Now, the other cool thing is with virtual instruments, you are not limited to what your bandmates can play. Now, I play for a band, and oftentimes when I'm working on a song with my band, I'm very limited by the instruments that my bandmates can play. So whether you want to add an interlude or a solo or whatever it is that you want to do, you have to think within the instruments that are available in the room. But if you are working with virtual instruments, you have endless options. Now, that could be a good thing. That could also be a bad thing because of the endless options, you can just go on digging and lose your way in that process. Maybe you want to have an upright bass instead of an electric bass. Maybe you want to have different kinds of drum kit for individual songs. All of that is possible. So here's a suggestion that I have if you are in such a situation. try to have a mental picture of what you are aiming for. Now, the mental picture sometimes could even be a reference song. You can have another song, commercially released song, as your reference that you're aiming for, and try to see what are the elements that are used in it, how many layers do they have, and then when you start working on your track with using virtual instruments, you now have a better picture or a better clarity of what you can aim for. Tip number 5, develop a mental EQ. You heard that right. I didn't say IQ, I said EQ. A single biggest skill that you can have being in a band is knowledge and understanding of how EQ works. Knowledge and understanding of frequencies, of all the instruments that you're working with, because that will allow you to write parts which complement each other without occupying or eating into each other's space. Lack of knowledge about EQ is the single biggest problem that plagues many bands. Now, the truth is, when you don't understand EQ, you don't understand frequencies, you don't quite understand how a certain musical element needs to be shaved off in order to allow it to coexist with other elements in your song, can often lead you to write parts without being sensitive to what the other musicians are playing, which means you are adding excessive information within a certain frequency range, which is going to cause a problem when you start mixing your track. And at that stage, you're fighting for space, and you're blaming your mix engineer who's unable to try and find space for all those instruments to coexist because they all happen to be in the same frequency range. Instead of that, you can be careful. You can try and understand how EQ works, how frequencies work, and write parts at the writing stage and arranging stage so that it complements all the other elements, doesn't quite stamp on each other's space or eat into each other's space, allowing your instrument to shine and project nicely even in your mix when your mix arrives. For example, bass guitar and electric guitars can often clash if you're not careful writing your parts. You're working on a nice, beautiful sounding riff using your 6th string on your electric guitar, and your bass player wants to play a nice high G string run. A bad idea to have, because it's going to start eating into each other. You want to learn how to coexist without stepping on each other. So similarly, if there is a floor tom part that's going on and you have an Indian percussion such as kanjira, the both are going to clash massively. So you want to try and maybe try and choose a hi-hat pattern instead of a floor tom, which allows the Indian percussion to shine through. So you have to try and understand and work through. Similarly, there is dholak, and there is dholak is another Indian percussion, and there's snare drums. The high of a dholak and snare drum can often clash with each other. So be aware of what you're adding. Try and understand the frequency range and see how you can write parts which allows you to clash far lesser at the writing stage itself. This will help you a long way at later stages of music making. Tip number 6, timbre and textures. Understanding textures and timbre that your instrument provides is a huge benefit when you start arranging your song. Suppose you look at a typical synth. Now, there are different kinds of waveforms. There is a sine wave, which is a basic fundamental waveform, and then we have a square wave, we have a sawtooth, we have a triangle wave. Now, you can have a synth line playing around the same octave range, but using these different waveforms, and you are still going to be able to make out what is actually happening and differentiate these layers purely because of the texture that each of these waveforms try to bring on board. Now, the same thing happens when you are, suppose, working with orchestras. You're trying to write string section parts, you're trying to write woodwinds, you're trying to write horn section parts, and you're trying to incorporate some percussions into it. Now, you see all of these different elements have different timbres and textures to its sound. A horn section doesn't quite sound the same as a string section. They have a more honky, they have a more nasally quality to it, whereas strings can often have information way more in that mid-range, a lot of nice sounding highs if you have a good violin sample or if you have a really good live violinist that you're using. Similarly, you can use basses, cellos, the trombone, all of those to kind of exist in the lower register if you want, the tuba, all of those to exist in that lower range by not really clashing as much with each other because the texture is so different. Tip number 7, contrast. Having a contrast between the various kinds of sounds that you have, percussive versus melodic, sustained sounds versus plucked sounds, simple melodies versus complex time signatures. Now, a lot of these contrasts that you have in your songs will oftentimes help you coexist without stamping on each other. Suppose you're playing a pizzicato part on your violin and you have a sustained part in your viola section. You are bound to stand out because the two articulations are so different. One is a sustained sound, the other is a plucked sound. Same thing happens with your guitars and bass. You have a nice sustaining guitar sound. You're playing the chord and this fully distortion guitars often occupies a wider range of frequencies. And in your bass guitar, you're not necessarily sustaining the note, but you're trying to go for a constant, continuous 16th note pattern. So you are bound to stand out really well. Apart from the fact that they exist on two different octave ranges, you still have the advantage of the contrasting parts, the contrasting articulations that you're using, which allows you to coexist. I hope these 7 tips have helped you understand how you can use different elements while arranging your song and working through your beautiful music, helping you to write parts which complement and can coexist with each other without necessarily stamping and occupying space in the same frequency range. And you're not overcrowding your song, you're not making your song a messy affair even before you take it through the further steps of songwriting or music making process. Now, a lot of these tips will differ if you are in a band versus a singer-songwriter or an electronic musician whose approach of writing music is possibly using a laptop and writing songs using virtual instruments and softwares. Now, in their case, they don't have the initial idea of fleshing out approach how a band works, for example, with a guitar riff and maybe a vocal melody and letting the band jam and spending a few weeks just playing the song in your jam room and trying out all possible things that you want to play until you have something convincing enough before you step into the studio. Now that is your arrangement process. Now in the case of a singer-songwriter or an electronic musician, the writing process and the arrangement process are oftentimes the same. They blend a lot more. They kind of mask each other a lot more because you're not necessarily writing separately and then trying to arrange it, but you're trying to do both of it at the same time, which also kind of ties into another step that we are going to talk about in another video. So feel free to try and modify this a tad bit to try and fit your needs and your circumstances. And in any which way, these 7 tips will still be handy for you irrespective of where you find yourself. If you like this video and you want to know more about this, please smash the subscribe button below and ding the bell so you're notified for new content. And also please invite your friends to check out this channel and leave your precious comments below. If you're already following my channel, you know that I respond to every comment. And if you have any questions or additional things that you want to ask about each of these videos, then please leave your questions below and I will respond to that. See you soon in another video episode. My name is Varun from the Red Music Box. Stay safe, stay healthy, wash your hands, take care of yourself, guys, and don't forget to create, play, and record.